On that little blurb, if I talked to my sister-in-law, she would say, not spent 10 years in academia, but wasted 10 years in academia. So thank you very much for turning up. It's relatively short. I thought I'd just have some pithy things to say, and I have a few slides to illustrate what I'm going to talk about. So the context is around quality and how we get to quality and what the problems are about how we get to quality. So we think about what's happening in the world. There's two main factors, and they're very closely related. One is around digital transformation. How do I get from my old manual processes into something that's more automatic? And I'm doing that for three main reasons. One is around getting some visibility. Until I can see what's going on, I can't really fix it. Once I can see it, then I have two main things I'm focusing. One is the top line. How do I get my customer engagement? How do I make the whole thing run more smoothly? The other is the bottom line. So how can I make improvements? How can I get a greater efficiency, ideally reduce some costs at the same time? So what we're doing is moving from these manual processes with a group of different organizations into having software run those processes. So as software run those processes from my order, from my inventory management to my delivery execution, whatever they are, essentially the business itself, whether you are a business where you build digital products or the business is run and orchestrated by digital products, the business essentially is that digital product. And so if you think about it from that perspective, all the nuances and all the capabilities that define a piece of software now define the actual business. And so there's a couple of things that are now, over the last few years, have emerged in that software has completely changed. So not so long ago, I would have a piece of software that might be under my control. I have my application. It's my green box at the top. My application has made some modules, and I have some teams working on it, and it's under my release cycle. And I may do this as quickly as 3 months or more slowly over 2 years, and I have that cycle. I'm delivering that product, and I deliver that on maybe my one platform, maybe Windows, and I have a similar type of users. I'm sending this out to maybe cashiers if I'm a bank, and I'm rolling out my branch automation system. And I have that one system, and everything's all fine. But the world has changed quite a bit, because I'm no longer looking at just the modules under my control. I'm using other modules from other teams, and I'm using other services from those other teams and other live systems. And so while my release cycle may be every 3 months, I'm at the mercy of other teams and other release cycles at different frequencies. And so I have a mix of these different elements that all happen at all different times. And also, I'm no longer dealing with one particular platform. I have different platforms and different structures and different endpoints. So I may have no longer Windows, I now have dedicated devices. I have Android, I have tablets, I have all kinds of other stuff. So I've now got a much wider gamut. And it's no longer just those cashiers, it's now end users. And it's now people who have if it's a bank system, first entrance into using a bank, or maybe people who retired and they're moving across and having investment systems or whatever it may be. So completely different types of users along my system, so it's much more complicated. And what that leads you to is that I don't have the luxury of spending 2.5 months building the software and then the last 2 to 3 weeks just hardening and fixing it, because I released it out and maybe I'm using something like this AWS authentication service. They just happened to release that some 10 seconds after I ship my release. And because they've tuned that a little bit now, it's using OAuth 2 in a different way, my whole thing breaks. So I've shipped it out, and then I get the call, why is it broken? Well, it tested in when we tested it, right? So I have this dependency to other parts of the world that I can't really control. So that's one part of where testing has changed. So in addition to all that, I'm now under pressure to release more frequently so I can beat my competitors, bring new features out to the market, and so on. So the other part of digital transformation is around the adoption of DevOps and the adoption of agile methodologies to develop and deploy my software. So what that means is I have this cycle of developing and building, testing, deploying, and release, And I may have gone from a 12-month cycle to a 6-month cycle to a 3-month cycle. Now I'm under pressure to release monthly or essentially after every 2-week sprint. So that cycle is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, and it's the whole cycle that's becoming smaller. So my testing window, and I go, well, where's my 3-week window? Well, in a 2-week sprint, you don't have a 3-week window in order to test everything. So I'm essentially getting to a point where I have 0 testing time to make sure that I've done all the testing I need for that particular release. Pretty tricky situation that I lead myself into. The Forrester report came out fairly recently, the path to autonomous testing. Some interesting factors here. In 2017, they looked at the DevOps adoption. So there's a number of companies who released their software products monthly or faster. Not surprisingly, 2017, substantial push, 36% of organizations release monthly. That's pretty cool. And so 2018, obviously that's going to be higher. Well, obviously not, given it's in my presentation. It's lower. And it's lower, with the increase of DevOps adoption, the number goes up, obviously. That's what you'd expect. But lower because of the quality problems. Because I'm now relying on more services that are not under my control, that are releasing at different cycles, plus I'm asked to go faster, and my timing window, and I say, oh, it's great, you can go faster, that's brilliant. Can I double my QA resource in order to deal with that? The answer is no. And so I'm now doing half the amount of testing that I think I need in order to do that. So those are the problems, and this is what we're seeing in the actual real world. So here's my take on what the issues are and what we can try and address them. So there's a well-known set of paradigms and principles around testing, and I think we've got to the point where the underlying technologies have changed significantly enough where we can revert some of these principles. So there's 2 icons or 2 images that I'm sure most folks will recognize. There's something called an ice cream for testing. And this is it looks nothing like an ice cream. I'm not really a big fan of blue ice cream, but it's an ice cream of testing. And it's an ice cream because it's shaped like this. The big blob at the top are the manual user interface tests. And then I would have a smaller number of automated UI tests all the way down into automated unit tests. And this is known as an anti-pattern because this is where you shouldn't be testing, because these are expensive at the top and cheaper at the bottom. So instead, this is the recommended pattern, sometimes known as a volcano. And it's suggesting that what you should do is write loads of these automated unit tests, and you should have fewer integration and then smaller and smaller number of manual tests. And that's because these things are perceived as cheap. I can write a small unit test really quickly. Brilliant. I can write thousands of those. It's brilliant. They're also perceived as fast because I can execute them really, really quickly. Manual testing is expensive and slow. It requires a room full of people, and they only work maybe 8-9 hours a day. And so I don't have 24-hour coverage with my particular team. And so that's why the ice cream cone is an anti-pattern. But there are some problems with this approach. One is that if I'm looking at my unit testing, it's looking at the code level and it's telling me something specific about that code. And in a bunch of our customers, they're very mission critical with aerospace and aeronautic systems. And so if I want to know where I am, I may call the API and it says, oh, here's your GPS position. It's fine. My functional unit test gives me a thumbs up. I'm brilliant. But if I look at it and I have a manual tester and they're looking at that instrumentation system, they may spot out using their human brain that says that, well, the GPS, I can see it's trying to be shown, but the speed logo, the speed label, has written over the top. So the API is saying brilliant, but the manual tester's flagging their hands up and saying, no, actually, this is broken. And so that, at the top, the manual tester is the safety net, the safety valve to make sure that the system's running. So if you focus on what the customer experience is, or the pilot experience, or the end user experience, the top-down approach is the only one to really give you the true measure of things. So we have a third dimension. So this is around valuable. So it's a super valuable to be able to know that's really not going to work, less valuable to know that the API is responding as I expect it to be done. So what we end up with in this system is that we've got cheap and fast, or perceived as cheap and fast, have trumped valuable. And it's an anti-pattern because of the perceived or the time and the cost of the manual testing. But if we can take this and we can fix the cost of the manual testing and invert the ice cream part of it, or certainly reduce the manual UI testing, then we get better and more valuable testing that looks at it through from more of a customer experience perspective. So the other part I'll focus on is, what does that mean? How do we get to there? What are the kind of techniques we can use to get to there? But I'm also focusing on the actual business, the actual user outcome is more important than the underlying unit test part of it. And while that stands true, and there's a lot of material out there that says you definitely should focus on the volcano, this is the way you should organize things, there's also a caveat at the end of those that also say, but if you're really stuck and you really need to launch tomorrow, then just run some run manual smoke tests to make sure everything's okay. So that's the way to really make sure it's all right. Don't run 600 of your 10,000 unit tests. Just do some end-to-end high-level smoke tests. So that's the sort of catch-all safety net that folks will use, even though they're using that pattern. So we can reduce the cost of that ice cream cone and make it a little bit smaller. So if we just say, here's a scale for how much effort it takes for me to do my manual testing, how can we improve that? Well, we can improve it by manually defining customer experience focused testing. So this would be the area that says, I don't care whether the API is saying this is the GPS position. Actually look at it on the screen and make sure that the number you're expecting is actually rendered and readable by a human. So I can manually create those tests and I can run those executed. Now at that point, I can run those 24 hours a day. That saves me a bunch of time. But what about if I can automatically create those tests? If I can automatically create them, that saves me an awful lot of time of manually creating them and also then maintaining those tests, which is a huge hidden cost. When I build something, I have to maintain it. So if I can automatically create those tests, that shrinks that down. So I build them and I can execute them. But what if I take those automatically created tests, but then only run the ones that I think are really important? If I have an increasing time window and I've created 10,000 tests automatically, I know I've only got time for 50. Which 50 do I run? I may manually have someone define them in some cluster, but actually, isn't it better to try and work out what's needed? I know all the information about what's going on my build system, my release system, anything else. How can I optimize that and exploit all the data I've got to pull out and run the next available test? So this sort of setup and using automation in there to think about how do I move up the stack a little bit to get some of the automation up to that ice cream cone gives you, a smaller ice cream, which is not something I'm a fan of, much largely, socially better prefer larger ice creams. But this mechanism allows you to reduce the cost. So what you can end up with, if you think about what we get out of this, is an automated manual tester. So you get the benefits of manual testing, but the benefits of automation. And focusing on the customer experience part helps look at it from that user aspect of it. So the customer experience testing and also the manual user testing. What does a manual user do? So a lot of manual testers in certain industries, say in healthcare, would be nurses. And so the other parts of looking at, say, a blood pressure system, a nurse would look at that with, the knowledge and think that, yes, the number is a number, but that blood pressure looks weird, and would think about and identify context and industry-specific elements of that screen and be able to work out where things aren't particularly wrong. So getting some business insight into the testing part of it adds additional, weight and credibility to the results. So the customer experience testing rolls up a whole bunch of different factors. It's not just simply the functional testing that we saw from the API tests. It's also looking at it from as the user perceives it. There's a real screenshot at the top there for if you it's changed now, but if you put your password in and pressed OK, it would say, oh, you've got a problem with your username, but the whole screen is blank from there. So then other parts of it, if I change my language in my system, does it still work? Do the words still appear within those buttons, those labels, or so on? And then with performance, does it respond correctly? Are there times where it's too sluggish, or the images don't load for some use cases? And does it still work in production under load as it does in the lab? And finally, it's around usability. So the API may say that here's the number. The functional testing will say, yep, I can see the number in there. But the usability part of it will go, yeah, but it's rendered on a blue font on a red background, and I'm squinting and I really can't see it. So that's really failed. So if you think about what from a user perspective, from a user part of it, is that if I can't really use the thing, I can't use the thing. So if I can't use the thing for usability factors, it's no different to the number or the screen or the button or the icon not being rendered at all. So all these things are important, and far more important than a simple API call and make sure the response is what I'd expect. So here's an example of something like that in use. There's the model. So the model-based approach here is a way of defining the system I want to test, and then you can use a model-based approach to then automatically generate the test cases. So that's the inception from the model that defines everything that could possibly be done, and then we can automate test cases from that. So this particular example, it has an Android tablet on the left and an iPhone on the right, and it's going to test a booking system for an airline element. The parts in here is that even though it looks like a very simple model, it defines an awful lot of variability in there. And so if I think about even a high-level smoke test, a regression test, that's defining all the things I think the user should do. So the user in booking this I should choose a flight, I should choose a seat, I should go to the payment screen. But a user could do lots of other things that I'm not testing. So the user could, at any point, rotate the device from portrait to landscape mode. The user could delay. They could go off and do something else and come back a minute, 2, 3 minutes later. What happens at that point? So there are all these parts that aren't in my regression pack because they're actually, they're too complicated if I do that. Even a rotate device, if I've got 1,000 tests for this and I want to now test it when I rotate the device, do I statically put those in 100 of them? 200 of them? And where do I put them? And I'm always testing the same place. I'm not getting any variability out of that. And one example, I heard this over the weekend, is to give a sense of the scale of variability. Even though the model looks quite small on the screen, the number of options are huge. The fact what I heard, which is somewhat related, is that if I took a Rubik's Cube and I mixed it up and I presented it to people in this room, there's an enormous chance that that particular configuration of a Rubik's Cube has never been seen by any human before. The number of combinations of a Rubik's Cube are just enormous, even though it has just these 6 sides with nine colors on them. So the variability is mind-boggling from even a simple model, because those are the things the user can do. Even a very simple like this booking, I can shake the device, I can rotate the device, I can wait at any times, and the combinations I can do those in the booking process is huge. The last thing I'd point out here is that very difficult to read at the top, but the topmost blue object there, that's actually selecting the device. So you're able to give the selection of the auto-generating of the test is what am I also going to run that on. So if you want to focus down and you think there's some problems on the Android side, it will focus more on the Android side. So the automatic generation of the tests, you can utilize a lot of different algorithms, a lot of little maths underneath there to work out what's the next best thing to do. And you can include the platform you're doing that on too. So an airline booking example is pretty boring. So there's another more exciting demonstration. This is running on a PS4, and it's a game, an unfathomable card game that I couldn't describe to you how it's going to work. So again, another simplistic looking model, and there's a data element behind it, and it's going to do some card game playing. So the part I liked about that is it's very different to the normal sorts of applications that we often get involved with booking systems or other transaction systems. And this is very difficult to look at. This has to be done through the perception of the eyes of the user. The speed of response is very important. And I'm looking at bizarre images and icons and animation. So the ability to drive different systems, I think, is key there. So what that gives us is this very simple flow. So if we can automate more of the testing lifecycle, not just the execution of the tests, we think about how we can, from a model, define those tests and choose the next best test to take. Looking at it from not just as the API return my position, but is it perceptible to a user? What's the customer experience? Is it useful? Is it usable? Is the performance high enough? I get this rubber stamp. It's more than just does it work. It's actually going to bring some credibility, enjoyment to the users. I automatically create the test, I select the next one to run. That gives me my continuous quality, right? So I can run this 24 hours a day, continually running, continually learning. That's all cool. And I have a DevOps cycle in there, but there's something wrong with the DevOps cycle in that I've only really talked about the blue part of it. I'm talking about the testing that I have in the lab. So I'm running my tests, I'm automating the generation, the selection of them, I'm running them as a user would, I'm automating the human cycle of testing or the manual element of testing. But what about the release bit and the monitoring? There's a huge opportunity to learn from what's going in there. And in deployments, it's incredibly common to have the dev team and the ops team, and we've referred to as dev and ops, but normally there's a chasm between the dev and the ops, in that the devs team will think it's the ops team's responsibility to have it up and running, and then the ops team have a problem, they'll fire a defect over to the dev team, and getting them into a merged organization is a large cultural change in order to do that. So you end up with these sort of examples. The one on the right, I'm sure you've seen lots of these types of examples in that I've built something, the users, therefore, will use it like this. Well, most people say, this is from one of our customers, a QA manager, and then she, I haven't quoted her, I haven't referenced her, just to save her anonymity a little bit, but she came clean and said, we've got no idea how our customers are using the app. And they know that there's a shortcut for doing whatever, one of the common tasks, but they don't really know how that shortcut works. But they know they have to make sure it works, but they don't know what that is. So they're testing everything to try and get that done. And the picture on the right is, you can imagine an architect drawing a plan. People are going to go out to the road, and they're going to go left, and they're going to turn. No one's doing that. Look, people are taking the corner. Why do I go past that post? I'm going to go straight down the corner, right? So the plans and then what's happening in reality are very different. And we can learn from that. Another example that I really like is this one. So cart abandonment in some industries as high as 80-something%, right? And for most people in this audience, that's acceptable. Right? People go, that doesn't really surprise me. And then if I think of that from the dev side, then, well, all my tests work. So what's really going on? This is just like, well, I've drawn my road. People should go to the end and go left. But people aren't doing that. So what's really going on? Getting some insights to what's really going on is key. So the part I like about this is that if that's acceptable, if people will put things in their cart and abandon them, and that seems to be okay, why don't we see this? So if I go to Tesco's and I've done my shopping, I've got all my stuff in my basket, when I get to the checkout, why don't I see hundreds of abandoned baskets with all sorts of stuff on it? I don't see that, right? Everything's in an orderly manner. So why is that 83% acceptable? Because that's not really the mindset of most of the customers. So you can track what's going on. You can monitor different situations, and you can say, well, all my tests work, and then we can, if we instrument what's going on, we can get some insights from it. Well, what's going on here? People are selecting an item, adding it to the basket. That's all fine. Another one, that's all fine. Maybe there's a delay in there, but they come back. That's okay. And I go to checkout. All fine so far. So what's the next step? Is that I need to log in. That's fine. Obviously, you need to know it's me. I'm logging in. So I log in. And I go, what's your password? And it's not that one. It's not that one either. Don't worry. It will remind me what my password is, and that's fine. So enter your email address. I put my email address in, and it goes, no, that's not a known email address. Oh, Maybe it's my other email address, and you put the other email address in, and he goes, no, that's not valid either. And at that point, I've lost the will to live, and I've gone somewhere else. So those are the factors that lead to the fact that you get the high value and the high number of cart abandonment. And so this insight here, yes, my functional tests are working, but actually people can't use the site, and that's causing the problem. So if we bind those together, what you get is our lovely system here automatically running the testing and running that and tuning automatically. If we then look at what's being used with our site or our product or whatever we're having here, and we look at it from, is the thing up and running and available? Is it breaking in certain areas? Just synthetically finding that information out. We can map that to then also how are the users using it. If we instrument the interactions of that, we can work out where people are getting as far as that all the failed basket abandonment are all down this line of failed to log in, what's my password, what's my login, what's my email address. That's the common path. That's what's driving the issues. We can then map that so the basket part of it can be a business objective, and we can say that this is an important thing. So somebody changing their address isn't very important, but somebody checking out, that's an important element. So we can get a sense of importance as we look at how people are using the system or the app. And we can feed all that back in to the system to give us some insights of where the bottlenecks or where the problems are from how it's being used. So we may have things like, this is our normal ratio of 1 in 5 conversions are failing, and it was 1 in 7. And here are the journeys. Here are the paths. Here are the common aspects of those particular failures. We bring that back into our system. So if we go back to where we were, if we look at, so here's customer experience. It's more than does it work. We look at it as the user would. We're delivering then a positive user experience, and I have my continuous quality. Now, if we feed in what's actually going on, we can have the continuous quality for DevOps. So I've actually got then feeding in what's happening in the real world, merging the monitoring and the testing worlds to bring out that insight back into my continuous loop. So now I'm testing it in the lab, but I'm also getting insights from happening in the real world, and then come back up into that loop. So this is another example, quite like this for a bunch of reasons, slightly more complicated model that you can see there. This also starts off with rear of the year, which is an unlikely slide for a presentation at one of these events. So this is driving a website, an underwear website, and all kinds of things that I mentioned are happening here about selecting, automatically generating the test, optimizing the test, and what have you. The part here that it isn't visible that I like is that this model was not manually generated. This model was generated from instrumenting the website and then built from how people use that website. So not only does it include what the common paths are, where the common journeys are, and all that sort of stuff, actually the whole website was reverse engineered from people using it. So you have, in addition to the context of the slide, I think that having that example of there's more opportunity to automate our systems rather than just have manually write these things and have manual users to then sanity check them. We can automate more of these sorts of things in order to do that. And I'll close on my last slide, which is one of our standard product slides. And this is how we do it as an organization. This is how we define it. We do testing parts of it and the monitoring parts of it. And then we call this customer experience optimization. The whole idea is to move away from the model of testing and all about customer experience and how can you optimize customer experience in an automated way within the reducing test cycles that we have to release our products on. So end of my presentation. Happy to take any questions or go for lunch.
Thanks, Gareth.
Thank you.